Starting?
Yes.
Yes. Okay.
Hello, everybody. Thank you for joining us. Now, I would like to welcome you all to this webinar, The Impact of COVID-19 on China's Engagement with Africa. Now, I very much appreciate the opportunity to moderate this roundtable, online roundtable, with such distinguished speakers. We have two excellent scholars to speak to us today. One from Beijing, from Tsinghua University, Professor Tang, and we have one scholar from TRT Research Center, Dr. Dahir. Thank you for joining us. Now, while I have the floor, I am going to take advantage and make a brief commercial about the conference. Now, the webinar is hosted by Necmettin Erbakan Üniversitesi in Turkey in coordination with TIGA, Turkish Center for Global and Area Studies. And the center holds online discussions, conferences since the start of the outbreak, inviting well-known scholars from different parts of the world. And just 2 days ago, we had again an interesting discussion on the future of European integration and the impact of COVID-19 on European solidarity. So please tune in for more interesting discussion in the upcoming days and weeks. Okay, going back to our discussion, over the last couple decades, Africa has really increased its importance in China's overall international engagement. So many developed nations saw Africa as a place of instability, but China felt it was a great opportunity for trade, investment, and mutual cooperation. So it's not a surprise that China has become Africa's preeminent business partner, overtaking the United States just a decade ago. And the relationship between Africa and China has a very long history and has a very long background. As early as in the 1960s and 70s, China has been very much engaged in providing several aid projects, such as the construction of the Tanzania-Zambia Railway in Africa, also known as the Tazara project. So China has continued to make similar efforts in recent years to help build hospitals, schools, stadiums, and highways on the continent. And when we look at the relationship, it's not only about assistance, rather the relationship is much more complicated and sophisticated. We see many examples of cooperation, economic trade, and bilateral investments from China. And maybe when we look at the relationship, we should look at it in connection with investment, trade, and mutual cooperation. So today, with our special guest, we will define the unique characteristics of Chinese engagement in Africa. We will see how China wants to transfer its successful development model to the continent, and how China also wants to benefit from the development of the continent. In the second segment of the discussion, we will talk about the impact of COVID-19. So globally, we have more than 4.5 million people being infected by coronavirus, and more than 300,000 people have lost their lives due to this deadly virus. It's terrifying. It's a problem for global health. It's a problem for global economy. But in the last couple weeks, we have seen a slowdown in major countries in Europe, including Spain, Italy, Germany, France. But at the same time, we have seen an alarming acceleration in other regions and countries, especially now we're talking about Russia and Brazil. And I want to take a moment to highlight Africa, where we also seeing the spread of the virus to rural regions. So what does it mean? We can anticipate hardship and some difficulties for health systems, particularly in rural areas. And the recent meeting of the G20 countries, the leaders also expressed strong support for Africa. Now, as the United States and the European countries put more focus on keeping the outbreak under control in their respective countries, China has been stepping up to support African nations. But the way China has been stepping up has some differences compared to the typical aid structure coordinated by the state in the past. Now we have many private companies, especially those operating in Africa, and individual donors such as Jack Ma. They have played an active role sending medical help, medical supplies, and medical support to these countries in Africa, from Algeria to Zimbabwe. So we will talk about Beijing's coronavirus diplomacy in Africa, its humanitarian effort, and its impact on bilateral relations. So without further ado, I would like to give the floor to our speakers, our distinguished speakers. First, I will give the floor to Professor Tang. I have the honor to be his student as well. Professor Tang is a resident scholar at the Carnegie Tsinghua Center for Global Policy and associate professor in the Department of International Relations at Tsinghua University in China. And he has worked at the International Food Policy Research Institute in Washington, D.C. He is an experienced scholar on African development and China-Africa relations. He has published many articles and academic papers, and he also has a book titled China-Africa Economic Diplomacy and Its Implication to the Global Value Chain. The floor is yours, Professor.
Okay, thank you, Zia, for inviting me, and I'm happy to be here and to share some of the views on China-Africa relationship. And so you can hear me clearly. Okay, yeah. So I would think I will start with because Zia talked about this long-term perspective. So China has this very long-lasting relationship with Africa, especially that took off in the 2000. And I don't know, actually, on my side, I heard a lot of noise. I don't know whether you heard that noise or is that okay?
There's a lot of noise here. I can't hear you well.
You can't hear me well, okay. And Zia, maybe you can turn off the. Are you okay? Yeah, yeah. I can also then try to turn my video off so that give more bandwidth to the audio. Yeah, is that better? Now the sound quality is that better?
Sound quality is better now.
Okay, great. Okay. Yeah, so first let's talk about this long-term perspective on China and Africa relationship. I think like Zia mentioned, in the 1960s, 50s, 1960s, 70s, there was already some long-term some political actions, but then what's more important is rather in the 2000s. So when we have this very strong growth of economic development, and that's, I think, the drive is mainly to drive a sustainable productivity growth. So this is in line with China's own development. So since the market reform, a lot of, in 1978, then China just did a structural transformation and promote industrialization and promote the market economy. And this all drives very long sustaining trend towards productivity growth, but also towards ever expanding market economy. And then I think after China itself grows, then its demand for natural resources and also demand for market, then drives the Chinese business, both state-owned companies and private companies, to look for other countries for opportunities. And this includes the Southeast Asia, includes Latin America, but then in Africa they found most of the chance, more like a bigger chance, because Africa was quite neglected in the 1990s, while the Chinese businessmen found this continent is full of chance, because they just see the continent as some market. They like in the 1970s in China, still a lot of underdeveloped sectors, and they find both they can sell in the domestic market, but they also can do the mining, and also they can try to export, like make manufacturing in Africa and export to other countries. So this all then, in fact, then the Chinese engagements in Africa are so comprehensive that it's hard to really grasp them with a short or simplified phrasing, because a lot of there are both state-owned companies and also private companies, bigger ones and small ones, but they work in various sectors, including the infrastructure construction, including natural resources, mining, and also including manufacturing, trade, and even more. So this is, I think, something which makes the Chinese different from a lot of other countries, because the Western donors, they often just work in foreign aid in one sector, but then they found in Africa, then they don't have support of other sectors. And when they, for example, only work in healthcare, when we talk about COVID-19, this maybe serve as a some introduction background. So the Western country donors, they spend a lot of money in to help Africa in fighting HIV/AIDS, in fighting Ebola, and all these things. But what they can do is usually just this doctor, some of the medical staff, volunteers, and also some of the donation of drugs, and also some experts. It's usually just the effects of this, also some like awareness campaign, etc. This, of course, is not bad, but however, that's limited, the effect. Why? Because a lot of healthcare problem in Africa, that's so deep-rooted in the whole society. If you don't have employment, you don't have income, or you don't have good facilities like infrastructure to transport the patients, or to facilitate the distribution of the medical equipment or the medicines, then all this like just awareness or this medical volunteers, then their effects are very limited. But by contrast, when China actually works with Africa, then they have actually more holistic approaches, because yeah, they also have medical teams, but these medical teams, they stay in some hospitals constructed by the Chinese government, and then they also there are also donation of medical equipment. Meanwhile, this medical team, they can also partner with some other like construction teams, so to really be involved in, like for example, in Zambia, there's an example, the Chinese hospital. It's located in a special economic zone in Zambia, which is constructed by Chinese company. And so that special economic zone, it grows, it attracts a lot of investors and also workers, both Zambians and Chinese. And that hospital then actually can work as a public healthcare facility and play a much more a much bigger role than just yeah. So it's a part of this new city development, a part of this industrialization effort. So this is just an example to illustrate the Chinese approach, this holistic and comprehensive approach. And for me, then this, although the COVID-19, it has a temporary slowdown effect, but I don't see that this will change the entire logic of China and Africa development. In fact, even within this COVID-19, so when China saw the difficulty of repayment by these African countries, then they also decide to be flexible on this loan repayment, so that these countries then get chance to recover, and then China looks at still the long-term prospect and for these countries to grow. So that's just maybe my short comments at the beginning. I will rather welcome the questions and the discussions. Yeah. Okay. Thank you. Sia?
All right. Thank you, Professor Tang, for the introduction on the relationship between Africa and China in terms of the medical aspect. And now, before going to the questions, now I want to give the floor to Abdinur Dahir for his part, and once we listen to his part, we can open the floor for discussion and questions.
Thank you.
The floor is yours. Let me give a small introduction to you before giving the floor. Sorry. So, Mr. Dahir is a researcher at TRT World Research Center, and he was trained at Oxford and Sakarya universities. And his main research interests also include the Horn of Africa and the Red Sea geopolitics, African Union, and Sub-Sahara African governance. Thank you for joining us. Now the floor is yours.
Thank you, Yusuf Zia, for the invitation. It's my pleasure to join you. Do you hear me?
Yes.
Yes, I can hear you. Yeah.
Can you hear me? Is it clear, my voice?
It's clear.
Okay. Thank you once again for your invitation. And during the colonial era in Africa, back in 1960 and 50s and even 40s, when Africa was undergoing under the colonization process, China has supported different African movements and different African governments to for independence, on the road for independence. So it was based on a kind of anti-colonial rebellion. When Africa became new states, even more further, and cooperations has started. Different Chinese and leadership has visited Africa. There were collaborations in terms of development, in terms of humanitarian, and in terms of global solidarity. So, but Chinese relations with Africa, Africa's biggest trade partner, TIGA, maybe taken use in 2008. So since that, China has invested in Africa heavily, infrastructure.
Mr. Tahir, let's wait until he logs back in again. I think he had a disconnection. Okay. Now he has joined the room again, and sorry for the delay now.
I'm sorry, I think I had some technical issue from the internet. Can you hear me now?
It's okay. Maybe, yes, we can hear you now. Maybe you can turn off the video and we can hear your voice. So it will be better in terms of signal.
All right. So to keep going my discussion, I think the long-term strategic Chinese engagements in Africa could be categorized in four. First is economic, as the professor said. China has invested heavily in infrastructure in Africa, as well as to get a market for its production in Africa. What we know is that China is the world's youngest continent. In the medium age is 18 years, and it's the youngest continent of the world, and it's the second most popular continent after Asia. And predictions show that the Western age is declining. I mean, there's a aging population in the West, so the future lies in Africa in terms of market and in terms of and collaboration. So China actually, I think, understood this and developed critical economic infrastructure in Africa. The second point is political. What we know is Africa is 54 African countries recognized by the international community and the UN member states. And China has been reviving its ancient Silk Roads, the term now called PRI, or Belt and Road Initiative. And China is actually building, I mean, Africa includes into the Chinese Silk Road. And for political purposes, they need the support of African countries and to develop a kind of political relationship which is more far, which goes, far ahead than economic relations. So I think Africa is important for China when it comes into its political and ambitions across the world. As China is an emerging powerful country to the US. So I think that was a political, and then there is the ideological side of the Chinese engagements in Africa, which is actually of promoting the Chinese model of governance. I can say this because the Chinese model of doing and governance, of doing business, is actually different than the Western model of doing business. The professor just mentioned that the West just focus on the governance issues, or to be more specific than fighting or giving aid for specific issues, which is contingency related with a kind of conditions. So China gives aid to Africa, which most of time, unconditional, but at the same time, there is a Chinese way of doing government, which now we know that the governing part in China is actually there's single part in China, and this has compared to Africa, Africa is a multi-party country. So from this, I think the ideological side of Chinese engagements in Africa has kind of promoting the governance. The last one I think is power projection. So this is more important. Most probably you have seen that China has opened its first overseas military base in Africa, in Djibouti, in 2017, and this spoke, I mean, volumes in not only in Africa but across the world. China now is no longer investing in trade, it's no longer investing in economic and political, but it's now, I mean, presenting its power to Africa and to protect its security, its infrastructure, and its nationalists and citizens working in Africa. And we have seen the 2017 video on Chinese operation in Yemen, which was to rescue Chinese nationalists from the civil war in Yemen, where the Chinese, I mean, before the opening of the military base, I think that film was a kind of debate the Chinese military engagements in Africa. So China now wants to compete with the rivals, to compete with the traditional powers in Africa, especially the colonialists, the Western colonial powers, as well as the US, which has been dominant in Africa since the collapse of the Soviet Union in 1990s. Coming back to the ramifications or the consequences of these engagement, the Chinese engagements with Africa, I think China has this question of no question asked foreign policy. This is a foreign policy where China engages with different African countries with no regard or without, regardless of their human rights standard, human rights record, or their governance model. So I can say like engaging with dictators, giving and supporting this day, because a lot of young people, a lot of Africans are feeling an anti-Chinese sentiment because China is actually supporting predatory regimes and the terrible with terrible human rights in Africa. So this is China, I think, should review, no question, policy should be Africans in terms of not only the Western media, whatever you call, a lot of jobs that there is a possibility.
We are still having technical issues with Dahir's. Let's wait until he comes back. Now he has highlighted the Djibouti and the establishment of the Djibouti military base, and now it's probably the initial step of a greater footprint of China in the continent. And he also focused on what Professor Tang also just now mentioned, how China engages in Africa more comprehensively.
With my internet, I think. I'm sorry again. Can you hear me now?
It's okay. It's okay. Yes, we can hear you now.
All right. So there is to continue. There is a debt problem in Africa with China. So I think China should not be just giving a lot of and money and loans to Africans, to African governments. So, but it should be channeled towards strategic development, where the Chinese leadership should assess like the possibility of these countries of giving back to this loan on time. And there is also the revelry now, especially after COVID-19. I think the US is losing a kind of sees this important time in Africa. There has been Chinese aid, anti-coronavirus aid to Africa, started from the Jack Mac African government has received different aid, including equipment, including technical support, as well as movement, and it depends how African elites and government
I think Abdi Nurdahi is joining back again.
I'm really
sorry.
I'm really very sorry again. I don't know what's wrong with it.
That's
I have used my computer to have discussion. Relations are negative. It depends how the Chinese government, as well as African elites and government, interact and shape this relationship in the future. And I think the coronavirus has impacted the economic relations between China and Africa. A lot of African countries, they trade with China more than they trade themselves. They export oil, and the lockdown of China has impacted a lot, and the Chinese products in Africa also decreased, fall sharply. So all these things shows you that the economic side of the Chinese-Africa relation has suffered. But I think hopefully this will come back and will re-energize in the next few months. And we are looking forward to see and assess how COVID-19 will impact the overall relationship of China and Africa in the next few years and few months. Thank you so much, Zia.
Thank you very much, Abdinur, for the providing an image of Africa and China relationship. And now we could have some time for discussion and for questions. Now I want to give the microphone first to Fitz. He said he will turn on the microphone. So if he's here, you can join us now. Fitz. Okay, now as we wait for the approval, I'll go with Joel's question. He says, what do you expect to be the outcome of China's bilateral discussions with African borrowers regarding the debt relief or temporary suspensions relating to COVID-19 situation? How do you think that the current fall in oil and commodity prices influence these negotiations? So first, I'll give the microphone to Professor Tang.
Okay.
And a number of countries have stated that the Chinese government must cancel the debt owed by African countries as a sign of remorse. So what was the reaction of the Chinese government towards these
In
statements?
fact, in the, I think, early April, when there was this online G20 meeting, then China also already expressed its attitude towards debt relief. And then at that time, and also even after that, then China also gives call for the G20, all the G20 countries to do more debt relief to Africa and also to the heavily indebted countries. That's exactly about the oil and the commodity price. They are so low, and that already cut the huge part of revenue of this resource exporting countries, so that these countries are in very difficult financial situation. And yeah, so the it's true, and Joel, you mentioned it's about bilateral discussion, because I don't think China will, although it's call for debt relief is made in the context of G20, but I don't think China wants to do multilateral debt negotiation with African countries, but rather with this more quick and efficient bilateral discussion. And this will be China's main approach. And I believe also that China won't cancel a lot of debt, but rather suspend some interest, because for China, the debt cancellation only happens for interest-free loans. So that's only like a pure foreign aid. So if you my class, you know that's the difference between the foreign aid and also the commercial loans. So commercial loans, it's about the contract. So China doesn't want to really like spoil the contract just because of this emergency. And the contract, of course, there can be flexibility, like the suspension of repayment and the suspension of interest. But the contract still needs to be served in the long run. And China doesn't want to make this exception. But foreign aid, interest-free loans, that accounts perhaps only 5% of China's total loans, and this may be cancelled in such a situation. And China did such cancellation also previously. Yeah, so that's just my answer to Joel's question.
All right. Abdenur Dahi, if you have, do you have any?
Well, I don't have a lot of things to add, but I know that since the start of this crisis, the epidemic in Africa, a lot of African countries have been advocating for financial aid as well as debt cancellation. So I know China is actually a part of that campaign, and I think China will be able to do a kind of multilateral or bilateral, as the professor just said, will be able to intervene. But I don't know like the specific details of this. Thank you.
Yeah, and maybe the reasons why the United States have continues to call the coronavirus as the Chinese virus or Wuhan virus, to put the blame on the CCP for the outbreak. And some of these civil and political leaders in Africa are also using the same rhetoric or the same terms to put the blame on the Beijing government and call for some kind of cancellation of the debt owed by these countries as a sign of remorse. And it's next we have Fitz. Now, Fitz, you can join us now.
You hear me? All right, thank you.
Yes.
Thanks, Zia, for organizing this discussion. And my first question is to Professor Tang. So, in your upcoming book, you talk about, you present this dichotomy of targeted or target-oriented circular synergism as opposed to a model-oriented mechanical dogmatism in the context of structural transformation for non-Western countries. I think I understand this as I was fortunate to take one of your classes last semester, but it would be helpful if you can maybe elaborate on these. And my second question to you is, when it comes to aid, one economist wrote a book which says dead aid, when she talks about Western aid to African countries. And in that context, there's also the peculiarity of Chinese aid, where they give non-concessional loans as aids. And could you please elaborate on that? And my third question is to the second speaker. And you were speaking about how the Chinese new base on Djibouti, which to my understanding is more of a logistical base than anything. But I understand your reservations about it, and given your study on the matter, could you please explain or illustrate how the Chinese presence in Djibouti is different than America, France, Italy, per se? And thank you both for your time.
Okay, so I can speak first. And yeah, so I think what Fitz asked the first question about this circular relationship mechanism, that's more about the long-term sustainability of the bilateral relationship, because China also wants to engage in the long run. Then the relationship should have more interactions. And while in fact even when you say this some said some African politicians, they try to use this strategy, but I actually don't see them using this strategy to ask for debt relief, because that's they just follow some. It's all often some opposition leaders or some politicians wants to make their fame, then they call for such things so that they can be reported and also be viewed as some hardliners and to attract people's attention. But for like real state heads, they know China doesn't like that, and they know China actually will is offering chance for debt relief, and they don't. I don't think that mature or real serious state heads, they are trying to extract more from China by doing these naive games like Trump did. And for the second question on this non-concessional loans, private lending, then maybe I can answer it in context with in connection with Joyce's follow-up question on China's private lenders. I think here the lenders from China to Africa, they if you call the private lender, they are just about the banks, commercial banks. They are not really private, because some banks like China Development Bank and also industry and commercial banks of China, they are the commercial ones, but they are still largely owned by Chinese state only, but some of them are also listed in stock market. So for these banks, I think they will also respond to such debt relief, and also suspend certain payment or delay payment, but perhaps the discount will be smaller than China Exim Bank. And it depends. Maybe China Development Bank can still give quite a big discount, but like ICBC and also Bank of China, then these banks, they actually have maybe less room to do such a big discount. But they will still do something because this is a G20 political call, and they will help with some of they will just show some attitude, because even within China, the commercial banks, they even tried to contribute to some relief of like the mortgage payment, and since it's a global disaster, and everybody, so from security insurance company to banks, they are all trying to do a little bit within their capability. And that's also just about China's like this non-concessional loans. Although they have commercial terms, but they also then have some policy issues and have some public interest also in their operation. Okay, just that's my part, and turn to maybe.
Mr.
Yes, so I think the question of Mr. Fitsum was relevant, and why Chinese presence in Djibouti is different than the US or the Western. I think the question is because China has had a military footprint in Africa before and had no history of colonialism or maybe engaging in conflicts in Africa, that will make China is now entering Africa militarily. So that is what making the sense, and also Djibouti is a very strategic maritime choke point. We all know it's between the Suez Canal and the Indian Ocean, and a lot of Chinese belt and road projects in the Horn of Africa, and even in the Arabian Peninsula or in the Middle East are very much relevant in Djibouti, and I think it's very important. But also, as I said, the military base is just for protection, for the security of their projects in Africa, and as well as China is also engaging in peacemaking and or peace operations in Africa, like in Mali or in South Sudan. So China has contributed to the African stability before, but there's also a kind of discussions that China is wants to impose its own version of and presence in Africa. A lot of discussions are going on, and we can never know. But we can. I mean, the general picture is that China is joining more than a dozen of military bases in Djibouti from Western governments, from and as well as from Middle Eastern. But I wanted to make sure here and add that something that I forgot before was that during the coronavirus spread, there has been, I saw that there was COVID-19 diplomacy, a lot of Chinese aid to Africa, but also there was coronavirus racism in China too, where a lot of African diaspora living in China were kicked off from their houses, and they were accused of spreading virus or becoming the second wave of the coronavirus in China. So this will also add to the new post-COVID-19 relations between China and Africa, and I think that that will not make a lot of an impact to the growing strategic relations between the two governments, the two regions, given that the Chinese government is engaging heavily in Africa. And we also know that some Chinese expatriates living in Africa were also subjected to racism and to attacks, especially during the first wave of the coronavirus when it was spreading from China. So we still know there's these discussions are going on, and I think, I mean, as I said before, the U.S. role in Africa and in the world is decreasing economically, and so China maybe is trying to fill the void and taking advantage of this. Thank you.
Thank you. The Guangzhou is home to Asia's probably largest African diaspora, and maybe this is a follow-up question for Professor Tang and from me. The mistreatment also has sparked international outrage and criticism. So how did the Chinese authorities handle the crisis? Was it just an issue of governance, or was it a form of discrimination against the Africans in China?
In fact, we had a internal workshop on that in the last month, and people distinguished prejudice, stereotype from discrimination, because discrimination that usually refers to some more systematic behavior, while this time the Guangzhou incident, that's just some rather misunderstanding caused by stereotype or panic in the a very short incidents. So actually, the both Ministry of Foreign Affairs and also the Guangzhou municipality, they reacted to that quite quickly. And I think some of this story on Africans were rejected by hotels. They just stayed maybe on street. It's also from social media. Actually, we cannot really prove what's the real situation. Some of these videos they just circulate around the social media without context. So I think, but they are the Guangzhou municipality quickly already set up hotlines and encourage the reporting of any kind of discrimination behaviors. So that's why you don't hear it after just several days, right? So it's actually quite a short phenomenon. Yeah.
Now I want to take some time to talk about China's image in developing countries, nations, especially in Africa, combining the question with Albert. Now, many believe that the fact that China has no colonial past, in some cases, there's even a close relationship going back to solidarity with some of the national liberation movements, as in the case of Algeria. How do African leaders and African ordinary citizens feel about the relationship with China? Do they feel they're treated as equals by the Chinese? Or do they feel China is investing in areas that are important to Africa's future? And Albert has the contrasting view where, taking into account a growing populism and increasingly exophonic commentary in countries such as Zambia, where Chinese success is interacting with the pre-existing inequality dynamics, what mechanism do you think China can use to avoid anti-Chinese sentiment settling in countries in Africa where social economic disparities are heated? So who wants to go first? I'll give the microphone to Professor Tang to talk about China's image in the minds of African leaders and ordinary citizens in Africa.
Okay. So you mean I should respond to Albert's question, right? So China can, in fact, China, I think the best way is just to to do some concrete things and to have maintain this more equal relationship. In fact, I do not really see this populism have a very impact, have much impact in Zambia. Because Zambia, it had a much strong hostility in 2011 when the former president or the later former president Sata was in the opposition leader, and he actually was more like xenophobic and agitates people to oppose Chinese workers and Chinese companies. But then actually the cooperation, they still continues even after Sata took over the power, and Sata actually became much more mild towards the Chinese investors, and also the Chinese companies. They are still, most of them, they stay in the country. So that's, I think, the way of China mainly doing when in fact, like you said, the socio-economic disparities are heated, then the best way is actually to contribute to the economic development. Because what China is doing in Africa is comprehensive. So infrastructure, healthcare, manufacturing, and provides employment. And also trade have this like a benefit, this reasonable priced goods to all kinds of consumers. And these things indeed, they actually make the disparities not so unbearable, right? So to some extent, they even try to bridge or reduce the disparities. And I think that this sustainable and comprehensive economic engagements in the end will lead to a more diverse development instead of just concentrating on extractive sector, or instead of just working with several elites. But the Chinese view is relatively more equal, and emphasize this equal status business relationship, and that's something also will be important for Africa for improving bilateral relationship. Okay, that's just my view.
Mm-hmm. So the image of China will be highly related to the how much impact it creates on average people. Abdul Dahir, do you have a take?
Well, I agree a lot of with the professor, and but just as for judging from my experience of living and working in Africa, the Chinese image of Africa generally is positive, is good. But there are also some areas where I think the Chinese government, as well as the companies, if they address it good, then things will improve further. For example, Chinese companies have created a lot of jobs and opportunities for African people, but at the same time, the Chinese companies were accused of hiring and bringing their own laborers and workers from China, and then giving the jobs there in Africa, while African people who can do the job are still jobless there in Africa. And also it's accused of bringing a lot of cheap, inexpensive, as well as less quality products in Africa, where you can understand like quality matters. So from quality point of view, there's some kind of criticism there. And as I said before, disregard to human rights and governance in Africa, where Chinese government does not comment on and supports different regimes in Africa, whether they are democratic or authoritarian or whatever. So I think if China wants us to be an active member and active in Africa, and and get the minds and the hearts of African people, I think the government have to change a kind of policies and have to address these comments. Thank you.
All right. And we have another question is about, are there African research centers cooperating with the Chinese research centers to find the vaccine for COVID-19, or are international scientific cooperation efforts to fight against the current pandemic?
So are you asking me this question or the professor?
Both of you guys.
I think the professor is more has more information. Because I'm not specializing on Africa China relations, but I flow the information as a researcher, as a journalist, and I sometimes attend conferences like this on China Africa relations. Yes, there's a kind of collaboration, and it's based on the South-South cooperation. Or that China is a BRICS member state, where South Africa is representing Africa in the BRICS group. So there is a kind of China think tanks Africa relations, but I don't think it's more developed. When it comes into this COVID-19 fighting, I don't know. I don't have much information on this, whether they are cooperating specifically on this epidemic or not.
Yeah, for me, I think the center research or collaboration I know will be the African Union's Center of Disease Control. So because this African CDC, they had already a very long cooperation with the Chinese CDC. And so there was already an aid relationship. And I believe the Chinese CDC must be in touch with the African Union CDC and to get information about the COVID-19. But I don't think that's they are working for the vaccines. I think it's more about this epidemiology information sharing and collecting. Yeah, that's the more important one in Africa currently. Yeah, just because of the how many patients, how many affections, that's the biggest challenge currently facing African countries. And I think there are also like a donation of this testing and also protecting equipment. And that's the main efforts at this stage.
And as the last question to raise, China's own economy is also going through a transition. Now we observe industrial upgrading, industrial structural change, and maybe it's moving towards a consumer-based service economy, high value-added manufacturing, and instead of this labor resource intensive manufacturing. So what will be the impact of China's economic transition for Africa? Does this transition mean that we will have more job opportunities in Africa or more trading opportunities in Africa? And this could be the last question for discussion today, and then we can close the floor.
You want me, or I think maybe Mr. Abdir Tahir, you can go first.
Okay.
Okay. So as we know, a lot of Chinese economic activities in Africa have something to do with resource extraction in terms of different natural resources, and especially the oil sector, where a lot of African countries export their oil to China, starting from South Sudan, which actually exports 95% its exports to China. You have Nigeria, you have Angola, all these countries export their resources to China. So I think if China, I mean, China's economic transitions into more, as you say, less labor extensive. Basically, I don't know exactly the figures, but I know that I mean, in the next decades, Africa will also be a hub for a lot of manufacturing companies, a lot of international production facilities. And China is actually setting up some plants in Africa, as we have seen some of them in Ethiopia, some of them in other countries which are near to the Chinese Belt and Road projects. So if these trend of Chinese Africa engagements in terms of economic continues, I think Africa, we will see more Africans working and taking parts in Chinese projects in Africa. But it depends, as I say, how the elites and Chinese governments, as well as the African elites and government, have tried to shape this relationship. And we'll see how also it depends on the global order. As I've said, this coronavirus is actually kind of transitioning the global order from west to east. I can understand that. So that means that Asia, and especially China, will lead the world sometime now. So we will see how this changes will take place and how long will take. But in general, I can understand that these Chinese engagements in Africa will at least continue in the foreseeable future. Thank you.
Thank you.
Yeah, for me then, I would say the economic transformation certainly will influence China's engagement with Africa. It will just bring to a new stage, because previously, in fact, the made in China, this labor-intensive products, they may even be exported and compete with Africa's local industries. But with the price of China's the labor costs and production costs going up, such kind of impact may not be so serious as before. But another question is to say whether this labor-intensive industries they will be relocated to Africa. Then that's a question we are not certain, because from what we see on the ground, then relocation happens mainly in Southeast Asian countries and also in South Asian countries, because they have a relatively complete industrial system and better industry basis, whilst a dozen of pilot manufacturing relocation happened in Africa, but their success still need to be tested, because the value chain and also the industry basis in Africa is so weak that these companies do not get much profit yet. So this is and also then with China's like growth and with some of this new economy and high tech, then that may bring other new sectors of investment in Africa. So in fact, we see some of these e-commerce investors from China, they came to Nigeria, to South Africa, to Kenya. So this may be a new trend. Okay, thank you. Thanks, Jim.
All right. Now time is up and we can bring the discussion to end. We had an interesting discussion on the unique characteristics of Chinese engagement in African nations, and we also talk about the impact of COVID-19 on the bilateral relations. So thank you for joining us. Thank you, Professor Tang, from joining us from China for his interesting input, and thank you Abdinur Dahir, for being with us tonight on this discussion. It was a pleasure.
Thank you. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Thank you, Yusuf.
Nice to talk to you. Yeah, Mr. Dahir.
Yeah, it was a pleasure. It was a pleasure. Thank you, both of you.
Thank you.